Hamas has said it's ready for negotiations for the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal after the final exchange of phase one saw the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners overnight. They were freed in return for the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages in Gaza, now being identified by Israeli officials. Buses carrying Palestinians arrived in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank to cheers from those who'd gathered to greet them. Joe Inwood has the latest.
For the first time, only one half of the hostage-prisoner exchange was filmed. These are some of the 600 Palestinians freed as part of the latest swap with Israel. Amongst them were 50 people serving life sentences, but more than 400 Gazans detained during the war, often held without charge. Their release came after the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages were returned by Hamas earlier in the day. Previous releases had involved ceremonies that Israel said were cruel and humiliating. Having no repeat was a condition of today's exchange. Amongst those released in previous weeks was Yardan Bibas. Today he buried his wife and 2 sons. Shiri, I'm sorry I couldn't protect you, he says. If only I'd known what would have happened, I wouldn't have fought. His sister went on to criticize the Israeli government for their failure to bring them home alive. Our disaster as a nation and as a family should not have happened, she said, and must never happen again. They could have saved you, but preferred revenge, and we lost. In Gaza last night, people waited for the return of those freed in the latest exchange. But they will know this first phase of the ceasefire is coming to an end. Negotiations for a second phase, which would see the release of all the remaining living hostages in exchange for a lasting peace, are yet to begin. Joe Inwood, BBC News.
Well, let's discuss these latest developments with Arman Mahmoudian, a research fellow in Middle East at the USF Global and National Security Institute. Welcome to BBC News. So, phase one has come to an end now with the exchange that took place late last night on both sides, hostages and prisoners. Could you give me your thoughts then on what might happen next?
Well, that's a very good question, Sally. I think now the big question would be the issue of the administration and the government of the Gaza in a post-war era. From the day one, we know that as we reach the end of the hostage releases, Hamas would be concerned about its existence and survival, and Israelis would be concerned about their valid security concern about not having Hamas and any similar militia running the Gaza. We have seen, as you know better, an intense degree of the negotiation and discussions, starting about 2 to 3 weeks ago by President Trump's suggestion that an American ownership over the Gaza, which was faced by a counter offer from the elements of the Hamas last week that they would withdraw in exchange of the Palestinian Authority. And then the peak of it was the Tuesday that Mr. Yair Lapid, the former prime minister of Israel, stated that maybe the best solution would be an Egyptian-led coalition rules Gaza for 8 years instead of the American. It seems all sides are trying to compromise, are trying to meet the other party a little bit closer, not or toward the middle way. But it's going to be a very long way and very mobile dynamic ahead of us.
The US Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in the region. Of course, the focus is all on now phase two and what that looks like and negotiations to enable that to begin. This was seen as the tricky one, wasn't it, with regards to what happens in Gaza, with the expectation in phase two that all Israeli military would have to withdraw.
Yeah, it's going to be the hardest part because as we move toward the last hostages being released, either alive or their remains, Hamas's concern or survivalist instinct would be more escalated and stronger because, hostages is their strategic leverage. In their absence, Hamas doesn't have much to hold against Israel or leverage Israelis with it. They would be very concerned of the Israelis' return. Israel can return to the Gaza even in an event of total withdrawal very easily. They destroyed the Hamas's infrastructure, much of its high command, most of its tunnels. So if they want to come back again after the release of the last hostage, would be very easy. We don't know how Hamas would be reasoned to accept that risk, what incentives can be offered, specifically speaking, in circumstances that neither United States or Israel are interested in having Hamas runs or rules Gaza in a post-war era.
And the issue for Israel, of course, and for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has always been from the get-go that Hamas must be eliminated. It must not be a part of Gaza and the future administration there. And yet in phase one, Hamas has been at pains to show its strength and the fact that it's still very present and running things in Gaza.
Yes, that is true. The videos from the hostage releases, the ceremonies that we have seen, it kind of displays that Hamas has a level of manpower. However, I'm not quite sure to what extent the troops that they have shown are newly recruited from many of the Palestinian youth, or they are actually well-trained, well-experienced troops. Also, we don't know to what extent these kind of ceremonial movements or drills are, let's say that maneuvers and sort of a show off or a stage, because you can always have a civilian carry a gun. Their infrastructure been damaged, but they still held kind of control in the Gaza. We have to keep in mind during the almost last decade of the Hamas's leadership over Gaza, they didn't leave any room for any Palestinian elements to rise in Gaza. So it is kind of naturally reasonable that the moment that Israelis withdraw, the vacuum of power would be a suitable environment for Hamas to rise and reemerge.
We will watch with great interest and, of course, very closely to see what happens next. Arman Mahmoudian, thank you for your time and your analysis on this.